Out of all the creatures vanished into the mists of history, none captivate our imagination quite like the dinosaurs. We are talking specifically about the massive, non-avian kind here. For more than 160 million years, they were the undisputed masters of the planet. They sculpted the ecosystem, evolving into a dizzying array of forms and sizes that seemed to defy logic. It felt as though their reign was destined to last for eternity. But that destiny was shattered 66 million years ago, when their party came to a sudden, violent end. You know the tale. A celestial rock the size of a mountain range collided with Earth. The impact unleashed such devastation that within 24 hours, the lush world had morphed into a desolate hellscape, seemingly wiping the dinosaurs from existence. Or so the popular narrative goes. While the giants are certainly extinct now, scientific consensus suggests some weathered the initial storm. Survivors may have clung to existence for centuries, or perhaps even millennia after the sky fell. The timeline is a bit fuzzy, and the fossil record isn't exactly rock solid in the details, if you will pardon the expression. So, pinning down the precise moment Earth experienced its first sunrise without a single dinosaur is surprisingly tricky. Still, we can paint a decent picture of that era, thanks to a geological epoch that kicked off right after the Cretaceous curtain fell. This period often slips under the radar. It is called the Danian, the dawn of the post-dinosaur world. What did it look like? If we assume a sudden extinction for the sake of argument, the answer is brutally simple. The collision caused physical destruction on a planetary scale. Picture a global battlefield, scorched earth, leveled forests, and a terrifying silence where life used to be. Roughly 75% of all species were obliterated, and the few stragglers were left fighting for scraps in dire conditions. Aside from the stillness, you would find yourself in a deep freeze and plunging darkness. The impact ejected so much debris into the upper atmosphere that it formed a chokehold around the planet. Sunlight could not pierce the veil, leaving the surface in a state of perpetual twilight, no brighter than a full moon for nearly 3 years. In this gloom, fungal life began to blanket the dead landscapes. Fungi feast on decay and do not need the sun, a fact written clearly in the geological layers. We see a distinct spike in fungal spores in the rock record right at the boundary. But this grim snapshot does not tell the whole story. As noted, the dinosaurs likely did not vanish all at once, so the instant wasteland theory is a bit reductive. Moreover, that total darkness was a fleeting nightmare, and the planet bounced back with shocking speed. Organisms were recolonizing the impact zone itself within just a handful of years. So, to get a real sense of the era, we should fast forward past the initial apocalypse. Let us look at the world once the dust settled and life began to stir again, just with fewer giant reptiles. From orbit, the Danian Earth would not look drastically different from the late Cretaceous. The continents were sitting roughly where they had been before the strike. In fact, a map from that time would look strikingly familiar to modern eyes. The climate also mirrored the previous era, maintaining higher average temperatures than we have now. It was wetter, too, fostering lush subtropical zones across much of the globe. But do not let the geography fool you. Down on the ground, it was a whole new planet. The most glaring difference you would spot immediately was the vegetation, specifically the trees. Before the blast, the world was a rich tapestry of conifers, ferns, redwoods, ginkgos, and flowering plants. Thick, diverse forests provided heavy cover and endless buffets for the titanic herbivores of the day. In the new epoch, however, the woodlands were impoverished and far less varied. Many plant families that once ruled the canopy, particularly ferns and certain ponds, had been decimated. Almost everyone suffered, except for one opportunistic group that actually thrived in the aftermath. Conifers took over, with the Classopolis genus in particular exploding in population, alongside sturdy shrubs like Beauprea. These few species dominated the recovery, creating monotonous landscapes. You could walk for miles and see the exact same trees, a repetitive forest stretching endlessly no matter where you went. Things would eventually shift as the Danian progressed, and flowering plants began their ascent to dominance, a reign they still hold today. But for a long time, low biodiversity was the defining feature of these woods. And were you to wander through them, you would likely notice something else haunting about this new world, the absolute silence. Not long ago, these landscapes would have thundered with the calls of massive dinosaurs and the shrieks of pterosaurs overhead. Now, dead air. Life hadn't vanished, but it had certainly shrunk. Welcome to the Danian stage, where the inhabitants were pint-sized compared to the giants of the past. Even the mammals, who were supposedly running the show, hadn't come close to their modern bulk yet. You could practically take a stroll without constantly checking over your shoulder, a refreshing change of pace from the terror of the Cretaceous. However, the ghost of the previous era hadn't completely faded. The fossil record shows us that certain veterans of the dinosaur age clocked in for this new epoch, standing as the final remnants of a lost world. Surprisingly, some of these survivors grew to be the heavyweights of their time, and weirdly enough, they weren't. Usually mammals, but reptiles making a comeback. Specifically, the crocodilomorphs were having a field day. They weathered the asteroid impact largely due to their biology, low metabolic demands, and a preference for aquatic shelters. Consequently, they established a global footprint, often sitting at the top of the food chain. We are talking about genera like Times Botosaurus asterisk, asterisk Hyposaurus, asterisk, asterisk, Dinosaurs, asterisk, asterisk, Champsosaurus, asterisk, and Times Borealisuchus asterisk. That last pair actually rubbed shoulders with the Titans, calling the Hell Creek Formation home back in the day. These crocs weren't picky eaters, and they carried some serious head, often stretching over 3 meters or 10 feet giants by Danian standards. Asterisk Borealisuchus times could push the envelope even further, reaching 4.5 meters or 15 feet. While most stuck to the water's edge, a rogue faction decided to conquer the land. Meet their cousins, the Sebecids. This was a fully terrestrial squad that survived the apocalypse, represented by creatures like Times Zolmasuchus asterisk, a Bolivian native that was modest in size but packed a wicked bite, and with the dinosaurs no longer bullying them. This lineage, specifically the Times Barrenasuchus times, would eventually evolve into the biggest land-based meat-eaters since the T-Rex. Talk about a glow-up. Alongside the crocs, another reptile group thrived, much to the dismay of anyone with a phobia of them: the snakes. They pulled through for reasons similar to their crocodile cousins. Honestly, they owed the asteroid a thank you card. While some groups perished, the lack of competition triggered a massive boom in serpent diversity, establishing a new world order where boas reigned supreme. These constrictors were giants among the Danian Lilliputians, matching the crocs at lengths over 3 meters or 10 feet. Another shift in the reptilian roster involved the lizards. Both iguanas and monitor lizards rose to prominence, with the monitors eventually climbing the ranks to become apex predators, rivaling the size of their modern counterparts. But if we are handing out medals for survival, one group beat everyone else, briefly ruling the post-dinosaur Earth: the turtles. They might not look like conquerors, but turtles are built like tanks, and I don't just mean their shells. They possess versatile diets and incredibly slow metabolisms. When the asteroid hit, they handled the apocalypse better than anyone. Better than the mammals, certainly. Scientists estimate that 80% of Cretaceous turtle species survived into the Cenozoic. Compare that to the mammals, a pathetic 7% made the cut. So, for a long time, it was a turtle's world, abundant and diverse. The only downside to being everywhere? Turtles are generally passive. Their population boom turned them into a primary food source, with fossils proving that crocodilians loved cracking open a cold one. So, the immediate aftermath of the dinosaur extinction looked a lot more reptilian than you would expect from the dawn of the age of mammals. But don't underestimate the furry ones. There were way more mammals than before, and they were finally hitting growth spurts, exceeding the size of a sheep for the first time. Mostly, though, they stayed pocket-sized and, frankly, kind of cute. You had groups like the Polydolopimorphia, an extinct order of metatherians related to modern marsupials. They had been one of the Cretaceous success stories, with families like the Hyopsodontidae making big moves during this era. Taxonomically, they fit within Panparacedactyla, meaning they were actually closer cousins to modern zebras than to the rodents they resembled. Don't let the look fool you. Ranging from rat-sized critters to hefty raccoons, these animals were likely dietary generalists that would snack on pretty much anything they could fit in their mouths. But, sad to say, their time has passed, and they are long gone. Elsewhere, marsupials were stepping up their game. The Microbiotheria family, in particular, was booming like never before, becoming a common sight during the Danian era. But let's be honest, as adorable as they might have been, they weren't exactly headline material. In fact, most weren't. However, the mammal kingdom as a whole was pushing the envelope, branching out and trying new things. If you traveled back to those early days, you might have spotted what were likely the very first mammalian apex predators and the heavyweight champions of their time, the Mesonychids. Whether they were strict carnivores or opportunistic omnivores, isotopic analysis tells us one thing for sure: they ate a massive amount of meat. Bursting onto the scene right after the Cretaceous period ended, they were the pioneering land mammals to truly capitalize on the power vacuum left by the giant theropods. Although artists often draw them looking like weird wolves, seeing one in the flesh would have been a totally different experience. You wouldn't link them to wolves at all. Most experts agree they looked unlike anything alive today. Picture a beast with a massive head, jaw muscles built for destruction, a relatively long neck, and a bulky, barrel-chested body on stocky legs. They could run, sure, but it wasn't graceful. If one were chasing you, you'd see it galloping more like a rhinoceros than a lion. And honestly, that tracks, considering they were hoofed animals, ungulates closer to rhinos than to true carnivores. During their reign, Mesonychids came in all shapes and sizes. One of the standout success stories was Timestosacus asterisk, a coyote-sized hunter that filled a niche similar to a fox or a small wild dog, just scaled up. It was actually one of the biggest creatures roaming its territory, which spanned North America, Europe, and Asia. Even if its gait was a bit clunky, it had evolved some distinct advantages for getting around. Some researchers even believe it was the premier runner of its time, dominating the field, which seems almost unfair when you consider it was already the heavyweight champion of its ecosystem. And the situation only got more intense as the Mesonychids grew larger, best exemplified by Time's Ancalagon asterisk, another Danian beast that rivaled modern bears in size. But if you ask me, they were far more terrifying than bears, specifically because of a feature that usually implies safety: blunt teeth. Sure, a dull knife is usually less dangerous than a sharp one, but Time's Ancalagon times flipped that logic on its head. It was a meat eater that needed to feed, so it developed a bite force that was off the charts. Who needs sharp edges when you can crush bone and rip flesh simply by clamping down with insane pressure? Yeah, definitely not a pleasant way to die. These messy kids, or Mesonychids, developed various killing styles early on, with some sporting bone-crushing dentition like hyenas, while others had teeth more comparable to pigs. They were all about diversity. While they were the largest mammalian predators, they weren't alone. They shared the stage with the smaller but equally fascinating Hyaenodonts, which, despite the name, aren't true hyenas. This family of hypercarnivorous placentals belonged to the order Ferae, which basically means they're kin to modern carnivores and pangolins, unlike the hoofed Mesonychids. These guys might have originated back in the late Cretaceous alongside dinosaurs, but they only truly began to diversify during the Danian. Like the Mesonychids, they had large skulls, but they differed by sporting slender jaws and svelte bodies. They were generally smaller too, with Danian varieties rarely exceeding the size of a medium dog. They might have lacked bulk, but they made up for it with a superior sense of smell, making them exceptional trackers. Plus, their teeth were razor sharp, built for shearing flesh rather than crushing bone. Eventually, their biological design would spell doom for the Mesonychids. While the hoofed predators ruled the Danian, the Hyaenodonts were playing the long game, destined to become the dominant land predators of the Oligocene, eventually growing larger than polar bears. But in these early days, they kept a low profile. Being small seemed to be the trend for carnivores back then. Other hunters you might have encountered included the viverrids and Similesto, groups that included omnivores and even herbivores. Between these predators and the small grazers roaming the land, so we've pretty much figured out who took over the land after the dinosaurs disappeared. But what about the pterosaurs? We can't forget that these flying reptiles ruled the skies with an iron fist for millions of years. Which brings us to the big question: who filled their shoes? Honestly, at first, it was pretty quiet up there, mostly just insects. Frankly, the bugs were running the show, but even they were still recovering, which is great news for any time travelers out there with a fear of creepy crawlies. But here is the best part. Among the survivors, butterflies were actually one of the most common groups. Finally, a pleasant change of scenery. Of course, aside from the bugs. You also had the avian holdovers from the dinosaur age, the birds. But, just like the insects, they were struggling. Contrary to popular belief, only a tiny fraction of bird species actually survived the extinction event. And while they own the skies today, back in the Danian period, they were far from dominant. It would take them another 15 million years to really bounce back. You know what doesn't take millions of years? Smashing that like and subscribe button. It really helps the channel grow. Anyway, back to the story. The land was honestly a bit boring immediately after the apocalypse. But the ocean? That is where the real drama was unfolding. Just like on land, the seas had lost their titans, The era of giant marine reptiles, think mosasaurs and plesiosaurs, was over. But nature hates a vacuum. A new power rose to fill the void, a group that survived the asteroid strike almost completely unscathed. And let's just say they are not exactly warm and fuzzy. We are talking about sharks. Loads of them. Out of the 28 shark families swimming around at the end of the Mesozoic, only 3 were wiped out. That left 25 distinct families thriving in the Danian. And these were not small fry. In fact, among them was the absolute largest predator on the planet at the time. Reason number 1, to stay out of the water. Meet times Ototus, asterisk. The name translates to ear-shaped tooth. This was a type of mackerel shark, similar to modern great whites, and believed to be a direct descendant of the shark times Cretalomna asterisk, with the giant lizards gone. Asterisk, Ototus times, wasted no time getting massive. Less than 1 million years after the Cretaceous ended, there were already 2 species of times, Ototus times, patrolling the seas, both rivaling the size of a great white. They could eat basically whatever they wanted, which usually meant sea turtles and fish. But on top of these heavy hitters, there is a chance a 3rd species, asterisk Ototus obliquus asterisk, had entered the chat. If so, that was very bad news, because this thing was a monster. We are talking up to 30 feet or 9 meters long. But while Ototus times was the heavyweight champion, they weren't the only sharks cashing in on this empty ocean. They were joined by genera that are still with us today, like Times lamna, Times and Times nebrius asterisk, and it wasn't just sharks having a field day. Other groups were exploding too, including the sea turtles I mentioned, and eels, which were really starting to diversify. This era also saw the rise of Anguillidae, a family of ray-finned fish that includes freshwater eels totally different from their saltwater cousins. So to all the unagi fans out there, you can thank that space rock for your dinner. Alongside them, we got the first cutlass fish. Like freshwater eels, they are still around, but they look a lot more menacing, thanks to those massive fang-like teeth designed to snag and secure slippery prey. But they weren't the only weird fish popping up in the early Cenozoic. One of the absolute strangest creatures actually appeared right near the impact crater shortly after it hit, and weird is an understatement. Maybe it got mixed up with some meteorite dust. It is known as Times Cylindricanthus asterisk. This extinct genus belonged to its own unique family, and it was the only member. Basically, imagine an alien trumpetfish. Except, on top of the long snout, it was completely armored. Sort of like a placoderm. But this armor was even stranger than usual, rough, asymmetrical, and sticking out everywhere. It looked like a cross between a fish and a piece of coral. Or maybe a fish with a serious barnacle problem. We don't know much about it besides its bizarre appearance, but its existence is huge. It proves that marine life near the asteroid crater bounced back incredibly fast, and even supported predators, judging by that armor. Overall, strange seems to be the theme for Danian fish. Let me introduce another oddball. Asterisk Apatoides. Asterisk. Now, this genus was actually a leftover from the dinosaur age, evolving way back in the early Cretaceous. But even after the asteroid hit, it wasn't exactly a rare encounter. In fact, all the evidence suggests we are looking at a specific type of chimera. And forget the fire-breathing hybrid from Greek mythology. I'm referring to those bizarre-looking fish, often called ghost sharks. They are actually related to the sharks and rays patrolling our waters today. But unlike their modern cousins, this ancient beast was a titan. Some specimens stretched over 3.43 meters, or 11.3 feet, dwarfing even the massive Goliath groupers we see now. While the late Cretaceous was arguably their golden age, they didn't vanish overnight. They held their ground well into the Danian epoch. You could find them swimming across both the northern and southern hemispheres. Scientists suspect that for a short window, they actually became some of the planet's apex predators. Their specific diet remains a bit of a puzzle though, because unlike sharks, they didn't possess rows of razor-sharp, replaceable teeth. Instead, they relied on massive, permanent tooth plates. In certain species, these dental plates were multi-tools designed for crushing, slicing, and shearing, which suggests that giant edaphidons were opportunistic feeders. They likely devoured everything from shelled organisms to other fish, sharks, and even any marine reptiles that managed to survive the initial extinction. However, like many of their prehistoric peers, they eventually faded away. They were ultimately outcompeted by sharks and newer predatory fish. Still, they had a remarkable run, surviving all the way to the Pliocene. They weren't the only holdovers either. Another creature, typically viewed as the defining symbol of the dinosaur era, is thought to have cheated death for a brief period after the cataclysm. I am talking about the ammonites. These were a subclass of spiral-shelled cephalopods that had dominated the seas for hundreds of millions of years. They were once a staple in virtually every prehistoric ocean. For decades, the consensus among paleontologists was that every single one perished the moment the asteroid hit. However, fossil discoveries in locations like Denmark and New Jersey threw a wrench in that theory. Experts uncovered specimens in rock layers formed after the impact, implying that a few populations hung on for nearly 500,000 years. The survivor list included genera such as eubaculites, discoscophytes, hoploscophytes, and baculites. Although none reached the gargantuan sizes of the earlier Parapazosia, they were still fascinating animals with no living equivalent. Together with the other resilient species that crossed the KPG boundary, they stood as the final echoes of a lost world. Appreciate you tuning in, and I will catch you in the next video.